A 70-year-old woman vanishes without a trace.
It had been about a month since anybody had talked to her.
I even left her some messages. Can you please just call and let us know you're okay?
Her former caretaker tells police she went on a trip with friends.
She was coming back with some friends. Don't know who the people are.
Bank records showed that her card had been used at 2 different gas stations.
But a search of her home reveals the horrifying truth.
The detective went in the house. He said it reeked of incense. There were just a ton of flies.
What I see is a big mound of concrete and what looks like a human shoulder, hair.
It just absolutely broke my heart when I heard what had happened to her.
And the evidence points to a killer no one expected.
She's smart. She thought, hey, I'm going to have time to get my story straight.
Did you not kill her? Look at me. Look at me and be honest with me.
I am being honest.
You killed her, didn't you?
July 29th, 2021. It's a late summer day in rural North Carolina when Detective Tim Austin gets an unusual emergency call.
A call came into my desk that had been transferred from the communications center. Janelle Sparks is the sister-in-law of Lynn Sparks Keene, who lived in Linville Falls. She informed me that Lynn was 70 years old, had suffered from a traumatic brain injury in the past, and it had been about a month since anybody had talked to her, and she wanted somebody to go check on her.
According to Janelle, Lynn has disappeared before, but never for this long.
And the explanation from Janelle was that Lynn, she was an alcoholic in the past. She would go sometimes for a few weeks that nobody could get in touch with her. She was just that type of person. She did have a person living in her home that was helping take care of her.
Elizabeth Carserino was the live-in caretaker of Lynn Keene.
Janelle and her husband live in South Carolina, and the rest of the family lives in Florida. So it's been a blessing to have someone taking care of Lynn. But over a month ago, Elizabeth told them Lynn had unexpectedly left town.
According to Elizabeth, some friends had drove up from Louisiana, and they had partied, gotten drunk at the home, and the next morning Lynn decided that she wanted to go to Louisiana with her friends. My biggest fear was that if she had suffered from a traumatic brain injury in the past, and she's out here driving, she's consuming alcohol, she's with people, could they possibly do something to her? Could she lose control because of her age and her health concerns? We have to get everything out there that we can to try to find her. Every description of what she could be driving, who she could be with, what clothing she was wearing. So I started learning more about Lynn from her family. Time is our enemy, and we've got to work as fast as we can to try to locate her in a timely manner for her safety.
Lynn Sparks was born June 17, 1951, in Pinellas County, Florida. She and her older brother Butch were raised by a single mother.
Her mom, Wanda, was divorced from her dad, Jack. Lynn and Wanda were very, very close, almost more like sisters than mother and daughter. Lynn had a very adventurous personality. We both belonged to the swim club, so we would go and swim and carry on with all our friends.
In her early 20s, Lynn moved to the Florida Keys and worked as a bartender. There, she met Russell Keene, a businessman and father of 3.
Russell Keene was a very eccentric man. At the time that Lynn met my father-in-law, he was already in the process of going through a brutal divorce. He had all these wild and crazy ideas and aspirations, and a lot of them he put to fruition. He owned several Pizza Huts, a couple radio stations. He had a hotel down in the Turks and Caicos.
Russell was a bit older than Lynn was. She was truly in love with him.
By the time Russell's divorce was finalized, he'd lost most of his assets. So he and Lynn moved to North Carolina, where they lived in a home owned by Russell's father.
He never went back to work. He was too distraught. He felt like a failure and couldn't get past it. Lynn was the one that went waitressing at Louise's in order to make money for them to live off of. She was a trooper, but they were a pretty good, loving family, like any family with hardships.
Lynn got along well with Russell's adult children, especially his son Russ and his wife Kristen.
I remember the first time I went up to meet Lynn and Russell. It was such a warm welcome. It really was. I mean, Lynn was just such a sweet person and really kind of took me in. You know, she never had children. She kind of looked at Russ and I like her children.
But in 2001, Kristen's husband Russ was killed in the September 11th terrorist attacks.
Kind of was in a daze. And that's when mine and Lynn's relationship really started to grow. She was a sounding board for me. We all cried together a lot. It brought us closer. She was so close to my daughter. They both shared the love of reading, and they would go to the bookstore together. She's the one who got Masley her first library card. They had a very close relationship.
In 2016, the family was struck by more tragedy when Lynn's husband Russell passed away and her mother's health began to fail.
Lynn was, kind of helping her out around the house, although I think it got to be a little too much for her, and that's how Elizabeth came in the picture.
Elizabeth lived across the street, and they said she was, very good to Wanda, taking care of Wanda.
Lynn was like, Wanda needs more support. I can't really lift her. And Elizabeth was a strong person, so it seemed to be a good fit.
4 years later, in 2020, Wanda passed away when Lynn was 69 years old, which is when her problems with alcohol seemed to begin.
Lynn was having a really rough time. When Wanda passed, it was really hard for her. She's lost her husband, now she's lost her mother. It was tough.
When Lynn visited Kristen and her daughter in Florida that November, it became clear how bad things had gotten.
Something wakes me up at 4:45 in the morning, and I'm hearing music out on the pool deck, and I'm like, what is going on? So I open up the door, and it's Lynn, and she's having fun. She starts walking up the stairs of the pool deck to try to come talk to me. Well, she loses her balance, and she falls. She fell over the planter, smacked her head on the pool deck, bleeding, and she's unconscious. I'm talking to 911. I'm trying to compress on her head, and they come get her. Doctor says, look, you had a brain bleed. She needed to be on supervision because she could get dizzy. She had a concussion.
When Lynn returned to North Carolina, Elizabeth Carserino moved into the house to care for her full-time in exchange for room and board.
Elizabeth understood the situation. Lynn was buying all the food, provided a house over her head. The next 6 months, Lynn was healing. She'd go to bed at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, try to sleep through what would be her drinking time. So she wouldn't do that anymore. And she got clean. When she got the all clear, I had been looking at river cruises. Go see new things and enjoy your life, live a little. Lynn was excited.
But now, it's been over 1 month since Kristen has heard from her mother-in-law, Lynn Keene, and North Carolina police are on their way to the house to check on her.
myself and 3 other detectives, we loaded up in 2 different cars and rode out to Linville Falls. Janelle, Lynn's sister-in-law, had told me that there shouldn't be anybody at the home. Elizabeth had already informed them that Lynn told her to move out. I went up there, knocked and announced several times, found that the door knob, it was locked. The curtains were closed. I was told that there was a Lincoln Town car that Lynn drives, and it was not in the driveway. There was some building materials for the wheelchair ramp that was under construction. Wood and some bags of what is called sackcrete, concrete mix. Nothing appeared like there had been a breaking and entering or any kind of violent crime. This looked like a home that somebody was actively living in, that they just weren't home at that time. And I saw no reason to go inside the house. Because of her health issues and the fact that the family hasn't heard from her, I went back to the office and have her entered as a missing, endangered person.
Detective Austin also reaches out to Lynn's caretaker, Elizabeth Carserino.
I called at least 2 times trying to get in touch with Elizabeth and only got voicemail. I left my name and number and information that I needed to talk to her. She may be the last person to see Lynn. I also have 2 unknown friends, a Karen and an unknown male, and Lynn took off to Louisiana, so I'm beginning to get worried. Could something have happened to them?
Coming up, the search for Lynn Keene raises new concerns.
We were all upset with Lynn, disappointed in the fact that she fell off the wagon.
And detectives find answers buried in the dark.
I'm following my nose, and the smell of something decomposing is getting stronger the further I go.
Are you saying I did this?
I'm saying you know about it.
70-year-old Lynn Keene hasn't been heard from in over a month, and North Carolina police are unable to reach her caretaker, Elizabeth Carserino. Detectives call Lynn's daughter-in-law, Kristen Keene, to ask if she's heard from Elizabeth. She tells them Elizabeth moved out after Lynn left town.
Elizabeth Carserino had been in contact for probably a month with Kristen Keene, but Elizabeth had not contacted law enforcement. She tells Kristen, hey, I'm not at the house anymore. I'm camping with my son up in Maggie Valley.
Elizabeth said, I'll try to reach back out when I have signal, but I'm not going to be always available. Elizabeth told me some of Lynn's barfly friends from Louisiana had popped in. They brought in alcohol, and Elizabeth said, well, I tried to tell her Lynn's not drinking anymore, and she wouldn't listen to me, and she said, I just went to bed. She goes, but the next morning when I woke up, Lynn asked me to go to the pharmacy for her and get some things, and I said, why? And she said, because I'm going to Louisiana.
She didn't know who these people were. It kind of heightened how she was feeling about it.
We were all upset with Lynn, disappointed in the fact that she fell off the wagon, and she had done so well. I even left her some messages like, Lynn, honey, I really need to talk to you to make sure you're okay. At that stage in her life, it was a lot for her to take off and just go somewhere. And we're like, what in the world is going on? None of this makes sense.
Due to the fact that Lynn mentioned traveling to Louisiana, detectives put out a bolo for her vehicle along the route from North Carolina.
On August 2nd, I was notified by the Cherokee Police Department that the car was found in Cherokee, North Carolina. They had that vehicle towed to their secure lot. They found the keys to the vehicle under the driver's seat. There was nobody in the vehicle. Nothing stood out to them other than there was a Wells Fargo bank card in the car that was in the name of Lynn Keene. There was a Social Security card as well underneath the driver's seat. That Social Security card belonging to Lynn Keene. Bank records showed that her card had been used in Marion, North Carolina, and had been used in Cherokee, North Carolina, both times to fill up for gas at 2 different gas stations. It is starting to worry me because most people would not just leave their bank card, their Social Security card, as well as their car keys all locked up inside their vehicle.
Further analysis of the traffic recordings reveals another clue.
The Cherokee Tribal Police were able to find video of Lynn's car coming through town, and it appeared to be just occupied by one person, but the video was very grainy and couldn't make it out exactly who it was. The person driving the vehicle didn't look like Lynn. They looked like a bigger body type. What's going on in my mind is, if Lynn's not there, where did she go? Where did the people go that were with Lynn?
Police had not conducted a search of Lynn's house during their initial wellness check, but now they believe there is cause to do so.
Based on this, I did apply for a search warrant. In the interim, I've received a call from Kristen that she actually had a friend go into the home.
I had a friend that was a former detective in Tennessee. I called them up. I said, find a way in. I don't care. He went in the house. He said it reeked of incense. There was, a couple items that looked like somebody had just been there. He goes, when I went down into the basement, there were just a ton of flies. When he said flies, I just felt so sick to my stomach.
Four days after Lynn Keene was reported missing, her daughter-in-law, Kristen Keene, is informing investigators about the new concerning details in Lynn's home. But the call is interrupted by Lynn's caretaker.
Kristen told me she was getting a call waiting from Elizabeth. So I said, take the call me back, let me know what she says. Shortly after that, Kristen calls me back and tells me that Elizabeth is very angry with her.
She got really angry at me because she felt I was accusing her of doing something to Lynn. I told her, Elizabeth, I said, not for nothing. You are the last person to see Lynn, alive as we know it, because nobody's seen her since. You're going to be the first person that the police want to talk to.
Kristen says that it's just very unlike Elizabeth the way she was acting. She was acting guilty of something. What's going on in my head is I need to find Elizabeth. I need to speak with her because her story of what she has told the family is not adding up.
As their calls to Elizabeth Carserino continue to go unanswered, detectives return to Lynn's home with a search warrant.
There was nothing visual to the naked eye. I mean, everything appeared to be very tidy. There was no indicators that any kind of struggle or anything had taken place in that house.
I checked the main floor of the home, and then I see a doorway that I don't know where it goes. Well, I open this door, and immediately I'm hit with a very strong odor of something dead. There's also very large flies. And so I start making my way down the stairs of this home. Flies are everywhere. And the smell of something decomposing is getting stronger the further I go. I walk into this back room, and off in the corner I see a pile of something covered with a tarp and a box sitting on top of it. I remove the box, set it off the side, and I pull the tarp back. What I see is something, it looks like a big mound of concrete. and sitting on top of it is a bag of pre-mixed concrete mix. And the smell is just overwhelming. And I can see mixed on the edges of the concrete what looks like a human shoulder, hair. I've got a crime scene. I don't know who's in the concrete. I think it's Lynn. I immediately call for assistance from other investigators. I request the assistance of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, and I start taping off the area.
The North Carolina Bureau of Investigation sends Special Agent Maggie Holder to the crime scene. Her first challenge is how to remove the body for identification.
I was a little intimidated trying to figure out, what's the best way to do this and preserve the body to make sure that we can send the body to autopsy.
They start chiseling away at the concrete. They proved it was a human being. Could not see a face. I could see parts of arms. I could see the thighs, parts of the calf. Very decomposed. Around the neck, I can see a belt that is tight, as in this person's been strangled.
While it's clear a murder has been committed, there is little else in the home to explain how or when it happened.
Initially, on the first crime scene search, it was not apparent that there was any blood or anything.
After investigators leave the scene, they call Lynn's loved ones. They are devastated when they learn of the discovery.
I kind of had already tried to prepare myself for the worst. I was sitting on the couch with my daughter in the living room, and Tim Austin called. He said, "Kristen, I'm certain that's her in the basement. Of course, we have to do autopsy and everything, but based on her hair, it's her."
Lynn and I were so close that it just absolutely broke my heart when I heard what had happened to her.
My daughter and I just start crying, and we just start sobbing. I'm just like, you don't ever want that to be true.
And their suspicion of Elizabeth Carserino continues to grow.
Elizabeth Carserino avoided contacting law enforcement. It clearly showed that she was trying to avoid us.
The day after finding the body, Detective Austin uncovers more incriminating evidence.
I was able to find in Marion, North Carolina, that the store where the gas was purchased did have video.
When he reviews the footage from July 29th, a month after Lynn was last seen, he spots a familiar face.
It was not Lynn. In the video, Elizabeth is coming to the store, driving Lynn's car, pulling into the gas pumps, using a card to get gas. And in my head, I'm putting it together that Elizabeth's supposed to be in Maggie Valley. All of Lynn's stuff is found in Cherokee, and we're talking about two areas that are less than 30 minutes apart. I've got Elizabeth driving Lynn's car, and I've got Elizabeth using Lynn's bank card. We had nothing saying that Lynn ever gave her permission to use this. So I went before a magistrate who issued a warrant for Elizabeth Carserino's arrest. It started going through my mind of how could Lynn have been taken to the basement? Could one person have carried her, or is there somebody else involved? I needed those questions answered.
From there, I began working on a phone order in order to get up on Elizabeth Carserino's cell phone to see where she was in real time. And so at that point, I knew we had to find Elizabeth fast.
North Carolina investigators have collected evidence suggesting Elizabeth Carserino murdered her former patient, Lynn Keene. While the search for Elizabeth continues, detectives take a closer look at her background.
Elizabeth Catherine Carserino, born August 6, 1968. Her parents were Mary and Carl Smith, and she did have a brother named Johnny. She was raised in Goose Creek, South Carolina, just outside Charleston.
We did find out that she had spent some time in Utahville, South Carolina. She did have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. And one of her sons she had just reconnected with and was trying to forge a relationship. The other son was incarcerated, and the daughter did not have anything to do with her. Elizabeth Carserino had no type of medical training. She was basically just a layman caretaker.
I think that her friendship with Wanda was kind, and so she wanted to help and just said she could be the caretaker. Elizabeth was kind enough, but she was definitely a very direct person. She seemed a little nervous around me.
The only times that in her criminal history that she had any type of trouble was writing bad checks. She had been charged with several.
Nothing in Elizabeth's record indicates she would be capable of committing such a gruesome crime. So investigators focus on tracking her down for questioning.
She said that she was traveling with her son and camping in Maggie Valley with him. And we needed to make sure that Elizabeth's son had nothing to do with Lynn going missing. And we were able to determine that he lives in Georgia.
When agents with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation interview Elizabeth's son, he claims to know nothing about Lynn's murder.
We got up on the phone line. His phone never left the state of Georgia, and he was also very cooperative throughout the investigation.
Detectives conclude Elizabeth's son had nothing to do with Lynn's murder and rule him out as a potential suspect. He informs detectives he last saw his mother less than a year ago.
It was determined that he really didn't have a lot to do with her.
On August 5th, 2 days after the body was removed from Lynn Keene's house, the medical examiner conducts an autopsy.
Dental records were provided which belonged to Lynn Keene and were matched to the body to confirm that that was in fact Lynn.
According to the pathologist, preliminary cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and ligature strangulation, and it would be in that order. She was struck with some object in the head, causing a big head injury, but did not kill her. Ligature strangulation came second, and that is what killed her.
Investigators now have a positive identification, cause of death, and a prime suspect, but they are no closer to bringing her in.
We were able to find a couple of photographs of Elizabeth. We put this out that she was wanted.
On August 6th, they discover why Elizabeth has been so difficult to track down.
There was a nurse at a hospital that actually saw the picture of Elizabeth and recognized her as a patient of hers that was currently in the hospital.
Detectives are informed that Elizabeth was admitted 2 days earlier on August 4th.
It was relayed to me through Cherokee Tribal Police that she was in a campground staying in a tent in Cherokee, North Carolina, which was actually only a few hundred yards from where the car was abandoned.
She had left the vehicle and walked on foot to a campground and had been camping in a tent. She took some Tylenol PM and slit her wrist trying to take her own life. To me, that is showing that she's feeling very guilty for something, but definitely something traumatic has happened.
Local law enforcement in Silva were able to arrest Elizabeth at the medical facility where she was transferred from their custody to the Avery County Sheriff's Office.
Your first thought is, okay, I've got to get this person to talk to me. This was just such an egregious way to murder someone, and I just wanted to know what happened.
Coming up, police confront Elizabeth about what exactly happened to Lynn Keene.
What did she do to you to get you over that breaking?
I don't know what to say to you.
She tried to use the old amnesia thing. I think she was distancing herself from the crime.
And Lynn's loved ones seek justice for her terrifying murder.
And we're both trying to play back this whole thing in our head. Like, how could we have missed that?
On August 7th, 4 days after the body of Lynn Keene was found in her basement, investigators questioned the suspected killer, Elizabeth Carserino.
My goal at the time was to establish a rapport to get her to open up to talk to us. And then to be able to use those facts that she gives me to establish a motive.
When was the last time you talked with Miss Lynn?
The last time I spoke to her, she was supposedly in Louisiana. She was coming back with some friends. Don't know who the people are. Only know what the one girl's first name is.
Well, I got some information I want to share with you.
Okay.
Lynn is dead.
Don't tell me that.
Oh, yeah.
And whenever he tells her that, she puts her hands over her face and just, acts really surprised and starts sort of crying.
While Elizabeth appears saddened by the news of Lynn's death, she says caring for the woman had been a challenge.
I was constantly cleaning up everything. Of course, she didn't remember that because she was drunk. She yelled at me and told me that she might as well pay somebody to clean the house because I don't do a damn thing to sit on my ass. And that pissed me off to no end because I did absolutely everything. I went and bought all the groceries. I put everything up. I did all the cooking. I did all the cleaning. I did all the laundry. I even put her clothes up for her.
And nothing was never good enough.
When she got to that point, no, it wasn't.
What did she do to you to get you over that breaking?
Are you saying I did this?
I'm saying you know about it.
I don't know what to say to you if I can't remember right this moment. I don't know what to say.
You want to go take a walk?
Sure.
After a break for Elizabeth to regain her composure, investigators try questioning her again.
We know you're human. We're human. We make mistakes. But we do have a job to do.
I do understand.
You did this. You killed Lynn and you left her in that house.
And it went back and forth that she just couldn't remember the details and what had happened. So then there come a point in time within the interview that I kind of changed my role and got more aggressive with her.
You got tired of her and you killed her. Did you not kill her? Look at me. Look at me and be honest with me.
I am being honest.
You killed her, didn't you?
Yes, I killed her. I can't get it out of my head.
That's right.
I can't get it out what I did.
Elizabeth refuses to go into detail, but her actions after leaving Lynn's house show investigators she went to great lengths attempting to cover it up.
Elizabeth is smart and knew to call Kristen multiple times and put her on a different trail, like Karen in Louisiana going down with friends. She knew to bring up that she went to Maggie Valley with her son. She thought, hey, I'm going to have time to get my story straight.
As for motive, they believe the growing tension between the two women finally became too much for Elizabeth to take.
According to Elizabeth Carserino, Lynn was very restricted about where she could go, what she could do, that it was pretty much she had to be 24/7 with Lynn. And I believe that over a period of time that anger and resentment and rage built up, and I think that maybe on this particular day, I think that Elizabeth lost her temper.
She snaps on her and hits her over the head. Instead of calling 911 of, oh God, I've messed up, I've hurt her, let's get her some help. She put a belt around her neck and took her life. I spoke with the district attorney, and he felt it appropriate to go ahead and have a warrant issued for Elizabeth for the crime of murder.
So you've got them in custody. So there is some highs, there is still some lows, because you still got a lot of work to do. This case has got to be presented in a court of law, and you're trying to make sure everything is tied up to where that this is going to be a winnable case.
After a week of investigation, Elizabeth Carserino is arrested and charged with the murder of 70-year-old Lynn Keene.
They called us right away, and it was like, we got her. We got her. I'm crying like a baby, and Lynn's brother, just devastated. First he lost his mom, and now his sister, so horribly, and Janelle too, and we're both trying to play back this whole thing in our head, like, how could we have missed that?
Like investigators, Lynn's loved ones are frustrated by Elizabeth's refusal to explain the whole truth.
She claims to have had amnesia, can't remember anything. BS. I call BS. She's lying.
The family's resentment is intensified by the amount of time it takes to bring Elizabeth to justice.
Elizabeth's attorney died, and so we had to wait. It took 2.5 years to even get to trial.
In January 2024, the long-awaited day finally comes.
I was there for that day. I was sitting in the front row, and in walks Elizabeth right through the door. She looks at me and then quickly looks away. Looks could kill.
I was told she had an option, plead guilty. It would be easier, and she might get less time.
Rather than go to trial, Elizabeth decides to plead guilty. At her sentencing hearing, prosecutors present new evidence for the court to take into consideration.
The crime scene agent who initially processed the scene on August 3rd, he returned and performed something called Blue Star. Blue Star is like luminol, basically a liquid chemical mixture that we use to look for blood that has either been cleaned up or there's small amounts of blood that can't be seen with the naked eye. Sprayed it within the master bedroom area, and it fluoresced quite a bit on the floor, on the bed, and in different areas within the residence. And that indicated to us that that is in fact probably where the initial assault occurred, and then likely murder there.
Prosecutors believe Elizabeth used the belt to drag Lynn down to the basement, where she used the bags of concrete to attempt to hide the body.
She's telling the family these stories that some friends and Lynn took off to Louisiana, and Elizabeth packs everything she can. She goes to the store and buys several things using Lynn's bank card, and she goes on the run.
To kill this woman that you had taken care of, and for the next month, lie to her family while her body is decomposing in the basement. It's pretty sick.
Lynn's loved ones add personal statements requesting Elizabeth receive the maximum sentence under the law.
My impact statement was mostly to let everybody know who Lynn was and how wonderful she was. None of us are perfect, but her heart and her soul, she was a wonderful person. She was caring, she was giving, she was kind. I wanted them to know about her. And the last part of my impact statement was directed mostly towards Elizabeth, and that she was lying, how evil she was. How could you live in a house where you murdered someone and they're rotting downstairs in the basement below you for almost 2 months? It's insane to me.
On January the 5th, 2024, Elizabeth Carserino was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
I'm a spiritual person. Like, I talk to Lynn every day. There is not a day that goes by that I don't think about her. Kind of like my husband, you know. I might not see them, but they're still here with me in spirit. Lynn was just a fun-loving, free spirit. She was kind. She was generous. I mean, in this day and age, when a lot of people have forgotten what kindness is, I mean, yeah, it's a loss. She never met a stranger.
They said the house still smelled like iron, not dust, not mildew, not the stale breath of an abandoned place. Iron, the kind that sticks to the back of your throat, thick and metallic, like something alive had been opened and left to the mercy of the Texas sun. August 1987. Heat pressing down like a weight. Air so heavy it barely moved. The kind of afternoon where time drags until suddenly it doesn't. The call came in at exactly 2:17 p.m. Routine. That was the word Deputy Carl Hensley used later when the paperwork had to make sense of something that didn't. A neighbor reported concern. No one answering the door. Mail piling up. A dog barking without stopping. In a town like this, those signs meant something was off. But no one expected this. The Whitaker house sat just far enough from the others to feel separate, not isolated, just removed. A single-story structure with peeling white paint and a front porch that sagged under years of quiet neglect. The kind of place you pass without looking twice. Until you had a reason to stop. Hensley knocked. Once. Twice. Harder the third time. Nothing. The barking inside was frantic now. Scraping, clawing, a desperate sound that didn't match the stillness outside. He stepped back, scanning the windows, and that's when he saw them. Flies. Clusters of them. Pressing against the inside of the glass, moving in thick, restless waves. Too many. Far too many. That was the moment something shifted. Backup arrived 6 minutes later. The door gave way after one hard kick. And the smell, it hit like a wall. Rot. Heat. Iron. Something final. Something wrong in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. Both men paused just inside the threshold, not out of hesitation, but because the body reacts before the mind understands. The dog exploded past them, a blur of fur and panic, bolting to the open doorway and disappearing into blinding light outside. Neither officer moved to stop it. Their focus had already been claimed. The living room was undisturbed. Couch in place. Television silent. A ceramic mug on the coffee table. Half full, a dry ring staining the edge where time had settled. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. No signs of struggle. Just stillness. Too much of it. The air didn't feel empty. It felt paused. The hallway told a different story. A smear, dark, subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. A drag mark. Something heavy had been moved across the wooden floor. Slowly, deliberately, not chaotic, not rushed, controlled. Hensley followed it without speaking. Each step echoed louder than it should have, boots tapping against the floor in a rhythm that fell out of place in a house like this. The trail led to the bedroom. The door stood half open. Inside, the air was thicker, hotter, still, and that's where everything broke. Margaret Whitaker lay on the floor beside the bed, 42 years old. Her body wasn't arranged, not posed, not hidden, just left, as if whatever had happened ended in a single, decisive moment, and whoever was responsible saw no need to do anything more. Her throat had been cut, cleanly, too cleanly, the kind of precision that didn't match panic or rage. It suggested control, intention, a steady hand. But the thing that stopped both officers cold wasn't the wound. It was the absence. There should have been blood everywhere. That kind of injury doesn't stay contained. It erupts, it spreads, it stains everything it touches. But here, there was less than there should have been. Much less. The carpet beneath her was dark, yes, but not saturated. Not enough to account for what had clearly happened. It didn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense. And that was the first crack in the case. The second sat quietly on the nightstand. A clock. Simple. Analog. Its hands frozen at 2:17. The same time the call had come in. At first, no one said anything about it. It was just another detail in a room full of details that refused to align. But later, that clock would become something else entirely. A point of argument, of obsession, of theories that stretch from mechanical failure to something far more unsettling. For now, it just ticked silently in memory. Because in that room, time didn't feel like it was moving forward. It felt like it had stopped. Margaret wasn't supposed to be alone. Her husband, Daniel Whitaker, was nowhere to be found. No forced entry. No broken locks. No signs that anyone had come in from the outside. And no sign of Daniel leaving. His wallet was gone. So were his keys. But there was no blood trail leading out of the house. No disturbance in the yard. Nothing to suggest a struggle, a chase, or even a hurried exit. Just absence. By the time the sun began to dip, the town already knew. It always does. Word travels differently in small places. Faster, sharper, less concerned with accuracy, and more with impact. Woman found dead. Husband missing. Something not right out there. Doors closed earlier that night. Lights stayed on longer. People listened more carefully to the quiet between sounds. Because this didn't feel random. It felt contained. Local. Close. The investigation moved fast in the beginning. It had to. The first 48 hours, everyone knew the rule. That window where answers are still reachable, where mistakes haven't had time to settle into permanence. Deputies canvassed the area. Most people reported nothing. No screams. No gunshots. No strangers lurking where they didn't belong. Just heat. Just a steady hum of a Texas afternoon that now refused to explain itself. But one neighbor offered something different. Mrs. Alvarez. She lived just close enough to see the Whitaker property from her kitchen window. Not clearly, not in detail, but enough to notice movement. She mentioned headlights. Not in the driveway. Not parked. Moving. Slowly. Circling the property sometime around 1 a.m., 2 nights before the body was found. She had watched for a moment, unsure. The lights cut across the yard, disappeared, then reappeared again, like someone tracing the edges of something they weren't ready to approach. She assumed it was Daniel. Maybe he couldn't sleep. Maybe he'd been drinking. Maybe he just needed air. So she did nothing, because at the time it felt harmless. It didn't feel like the beginning of anything. That detail went into the report. And like so many things in this case, it stayed there, unresolved, unanswered, quietly waiting. The autopsy didn't bring clarity. It made things worse. Time of death, estimated between 36 and 48 hours before discovery. 'Cause severe blood loss from a precise incision across the throat. No defensive wounds. None. No bruising on the arms. No cuts on the hands. No signs that Margaret had tried to fight back. Which meant one thing. She hadn't seen it coming. Or she had, and didn't believe she was in danger. Toxicology came back clean. No sedatives. No alcohol. No substances that could explain her lack of resistance. She had been conscious, aware, and still she hadn't fought. That detail sat heavily with investigators because it suggested familiarity, trust, the kind of closeness that turns deadly without warning. Then came the confirmation that changed the entire direction of the case. The blood, or more accurately, the missing blood. Forensics determined that a significant volume was unaccounted for, not absorbed into flooring, not hidden beneath furniture, not evaporated by heat, removed deliberately. That wasn't panic. That wasn't impulsive. That was method. And method meant something colder than anger, something planned. Daniel Whitaker became the primary suspect almost immediately. It was inevitable. Spouse missing. No forced entry. Controlled scene. It fit too neatly not to. But as investigators began to dig into his life, the picture didn't sharpen. It blurred. Daniel had no record, no history of violence, no known debts, no obvious enemies. He worked a steady job, kept to himself, paid his bills on time. The kind of man people struggle to describe because there's nothing dramatic to say. Quiet, polite, normal. His marriage to Margaret appeared stable. No reported conflicts, no known affairs, no financial strain that would push things toward desperation, which left investigators standing in a house full of evidence that pointed nowhere. A clean kill, a controlled environment, a missing husband, and no motive. Days stretched into weeks. The urgency faded, not because they stopped trying, but because every path led back to the same question. Where was Daniel Whitaker? Had he run? Had he been taken? Or had he become something else entirely? Then, nearly 2 weeks after the discovery, something surfaced. A truck, abandoned, found nearly 60 miles away along a stretch of highway that cut through dry, empty land where nothing lingered unless it had to. It belonged to Daniel. The doors were unlocked, key still in ignition, driver's side slightly ajar, as if whoever stepped out didn't bother to close it all the way. Inside there was nothing, no blood, no signs of struggle, no indication that anything violent had happened there. Just a vehicle, left behind in a place that didn't ask questions. That discovery shifted everything, because now Daniel Whitaker wasn't just missing. He was either running from something, or he had been pulled into it. And the deeper investigators looked, the more that line began to dissolve, leaving behind something far more unsettling, the possibility that whatever had happened inside the house hadn't ended there. It had just begun. The truck sat under a sky that looked too wide for secrets. Bleached sunlight, endless horizon, wind dragging dust across the asphalt in thin, restless sheets. It was a kind of place where things disappeared without resistance, where distance swallowed sound and time stretched thin. And in the middle of it, Daniel Whitaker's truck. It didn't look abandoned at first glance. Not completely. The body was intact. No broken glass. No damage. Just still. Out of place in a way that felt subtle until you stood close enough to feel it. The driver's door hung slightly open. Key still in ignition. That detail hit investigators harder than anything else. People don't leave keys behind unless they don't plan to come back. Or they never had the chance. The interior was clean. Too clean. No blood. No signs of struggle. No personal belongings scattered. No indication of panic. Just a faint layer of dust beginning to settle across the dashboard, already erasing whatever story had been written there. The engine was cold. It had been sitting for days. Forensics combed through it inch by inch. Fibers, prints, anything, nothing. It was as if the truck had been carefully emptied, not just of objects, but of meaning. A shell, a dead end. But dead ends in cases like this don't stay quiet. They echo. because every absence forces a question louder than any evidence. If Daniel had killed Margaret, why leave the truck like this? Why not drive farther? Why not destroy it? Why not disappear properly? And if he hadn't, then who had? The timeline began to shift under pressure. Margaret's estimated time of death placed the murder roughly 2 nights before the body was discovered. The same night, Mrs. Alvarez saw the headlights moving slowly across the property. Now that detail didn't feel like background noise anymore. It felt central. Investigators returned to her house. Same kitchen, same window, same angle. She described it again, more carefully this time. The lights weren't erratic. They weren't lost. They were deliberate. A slow loop around the property. Then another, not once, not twice, 3 times, as if whoever was behind the wheel was rehearsing something, or deciding. She couldn't describe a vehicle. Too dark, too far, but she was certain of one thing. It wasn't the Whitaker truck. That realization tightened the case instead of loosening it, because now there was another presence, another vehicle, another person who had been there that night, and no one else had seen it, no other witnesses, no tire tracks that survived the dry wind and loose dirt, no cameras, no record, just one woman's memory, hanging alone in a case that was already slipping. Back at the house, something else began to stand out, not something new, something overlooked. The bedroom, specifically the floor. There were faint impressions in the carpet near where Margaret's body had been found. Subtle, easily dismissed as natural wear, but under proper lighting, under the right angle, they formed a pattern, parallel lines, not from shoes, not from furniture, something narrower, something dragged, but not her body, something else, something that had been placed on the floor and then removed. Investigators began to reconstruct the scene again, piece by piece, stripping it down to what was there and what wasn't. Margaret had been killed where she was found. That part held. But the blood loss didn't match the visible evidence, which meant the missing volume had been collected somewhere else, contained, transported. That realization shifted the tone again, because now the question wasn't just who killed her. It was why take the blood. Theories surfaced quickly, some grounded, some not. Ritualistic behavior, staging, an attempt to obscure time of death, or something more calculated, something tied to control, to method, to a level of detachment that didn't align with a crime of passion. Daniel Whitaker didn't fit that profile, at least not on paper. But paper has a way of lying, or leaving things out. Investigators began digging deeper into his background, not just the surface-level records, not just employment history and financial statements. They looked for gaps, periods unaccounted for, connections that didn't make sense. And slowly, small inconsistencies began to surface. Nothing explosive, nothing definitive, but enough to shift the tone. There were nights Daniel couldn't be placed, hours unaccounted for. No explanation, no witnesses. Margaret's friends, those who were willing to speak, mentioned something else. A change, subtle, recent. She had seemed distracted, on edge, not frightened, but unsettled, as if something had entered her life quietly and refused to leave. When asked directly, she dismissed it, said everything was fine. That phrase again, everything is fine, the most dangerous lie in any investigation, because it closes doors before anyone realizes they needed to be opened. Phone records were pulled. Most calls were routine. Family, work, local numbers. But there was one number that appeared repeatedly over the last 3 months. Unfamiliar, unlisted, calls that lasted only seconds, sometimes less than 10. Enough to connect, not enough to say anything. That number became a focus. Tracing it led nowhere at first. A payphone, then another, different locations. Same pattern. Short calls, late hours, always ending abruptly. Someone had been contacting the Whitaker house. Someone who didn't want to be traced. And someone who knew how not to be. That didn't align with Daniel's profile either, which raised another possibility. The contact wasn't for him. It was for Margaret. That idea settled heavily because it opened a door investigators hadn't fully considered. That Margaret Whitaker had a life that didn't exist in the records. A second layer, hidden, carefully. And whatever that layer was, it had followed her home. The timeline tightened again. Calls in the weeks leading up to her death. Lights circling the house. No signs of forced entry. No defensive wounds. She had let someone in, or she had been expecting them. That detail changed everything, because it meant the moment of violence didn't begin with fear. It began with recognition. Back at the abandoned truck, a second sweep turned up something small, almost insignificant, wedged deep beneath the passenger seat. A receipt, crumpled, faded, from a gas station nearly 80 miles south of the Whitaker home. Time-stamped, the morning after Margaret's estimated time of death. That single piece of paper fractured the timeline again, because it placed the truck far from the house after the murder had already occurred, which meant someone had driven it, and that someone had stopped, paid, left a trace. The station clerk was tracked down. He remembered the truck. Not clearly, but enough. Said the driver kept his head down. Cap pulled low. Didn't speak much. Paid in cash. Left quickly. Nothing unusual. Except he was alone. That statement was recorded, replayed, analyzed. Because if Daniel had been driving, it suggested he was alive after the murder. On the run. But if it wasn't Daniel, then someone else had taken his truck. Someone who had already been inside that house. Someone who had already done what couldn't be undone. And the case began to stretch in two directions at once. A missing husband who might be a killer, or a missing husband who had been erased. Weeks turned into months. The heat faded. The air cooled, but the case didn't. It lingered, unresolved, each lead branching into uncertainty instead of answers. The phone number went silent. The headlights were never seen again. The truck became just another piece of evidence sitting under fluorescent lights, stripped of context. And Margaret Whitaker, she became a file, a name, a photograph pinned to a board among questions that refused to connect. But the thing about cases like this, they don't disappear. They wait, quietly, patiently, for something to shift, for something buried to surface, for someone to make a mistake. And somewhere in the space between what was known and what was missing, the truth was already there, just out of reach, watching, waiting, for the moment it would finally be seen. Time didn't solve the Whitaker case. It thinned it, like heat over asphalt, blurring edges, softening details, until everything that once felt sharp began to dissolve into something harder to hold, harder to prove. Weeks passed, then months. The urgency faded from the outside, but inside the file, inside the minds of few who refused to let it go, the pressure only shifted, because the problem wasn't a lack of evidence. It was too many pieces that didn't belong to the same puzzle. The phone calls, the missing blood, the second vehicle, the abandoned truck miles away. And in the center of it all, two people whose lives, on paper, didn't justify any of it. Margaret Whitaker, Daniel Whitaker. Ordinary names, ordinary lives, until they weren't. The first crack didn't come from forensics. It came from paperwork, old paperwork, buried deep in county records. The kind no one checks unless they're desperate enough to believe answers might hide in places everyone else ignores. A junior investigator, new, meticulous, not yet worn down by dead ends, was cross-referencing property documents tied to Whitaker home. It should have been simple. Margaret and Daniel purchased the house in 1981. Joint ownership. Nothing unusual. But there was something before that. A name. Not Daniel. Not Margaret. The property before them had belonged to someone else. Someone with a different last name. Harper. The record wasn't remarkable on its own. Houses change hands. Names come and go. But the date mattered. Because the transfer hadn't happened through a standard sale. It had been inherited. Margaret Whitaker, before she was Whitaker, had received the property directly, which meant one thing. She had a connection to the previous owner. A connection that had never been mentioned in interviews, never surfaced in background checks, never brought up by friends. because no one had thought to ask. The file on the previous owner was thin. Name, Evelyn Harper. Age at death, 67. Cause natural causes. No immediate family listed. No spouse. No children. A quiet life that ended quietly. On paper. But paper had already proven unreliable. Investigators pulled everything they could find on Evelyn Harper. Utilities. Medical records. Old mail. Anything that could reconstruct a life that had ended without attention. And that's when the pattern began to shift. Because Evelyn Harper hadn't lived as quietly as the record suggested. There were gaps. Long ones. Years where her presence simply disappeared. No employment records. No tax filings. No litigiosi. Nothing. Then suddenly she would reappear. Same address. Same name. As if she had never left. That kind of absence doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design. Or by necessity. And Margaret Whitaker had inherited that house without ever mentioning the woman who owned it before. When confronted, when they tried to confront her friends again to ask about Evelyn, about any connection, no one had answers. No one had even heard the name, which meant Margaret had kept that part of her life separate, hidden, carefully. That detail alone wouldn't have been enough. But then came the photographs. They were found in a box in the attic, overlooked during the initial sweep, tucked behind insulation, sealed in a container that didn't belong with anything else in the house. Inside images, dozens of them, old, faded, some black and white, others washed out color from the early 70s. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Family gatherings, outdoor scenes, people standing too stiff, smiling too little. But there was something off. The same faces appeared again and again, not aging, not changing, just present. And among them, Margaret, younger, different, but unmistakably her, standing beside a woman investigators now recognized from old records, Evelyn Harper. That changed everything, because it meant Margaret hadn't just inherited the house. She had known Evelyn closely, long before anyone in her current life had entered the picture. The timeline fractured again. Margaret Whitaker, as the town knew her, didn't begin when she arrived with Daniel. She began somewhere else. Earlier, in a life that had been cut away. Deliberately, the more they dug, the stranger became. There were no records of Margaret before a certain point. No birth certificate under that name. No school records that aligned. No trace of her existence before her early 20s. It was as if she had stepped into the world fully formed, with a name, with a history that couldn't be verified. And no one had questioned it, because people don't question what looks normal until it breaks. Investigators began to consider something they hadn't before. That Margaret Whitaker wasn't who she said she was. And if that was true, then Daniel Whitaker might not have been either. That possibility recontextualized everything. The marriage, the isolation, the lack of conflict, the quiet life that now felt less like stability and more like concealment. The phone number resurfaced in a different light. Those short calls, late at night, too brief to trace, too consistent to ignore. They weren't random. They were communication, controlled, purposeful, and now, possibly tied to a past that had never been meant to surface. The number was traced again, harder this time, deeper. It led to a pattern of payphones positioned along a loose geographic line stretching south from the Whitaker house, toward the same direction where the truck had been found. Not scattered, not random, aligned, like markers or checkpoints. That line didn't end at the gas station. It kept going, into areas with even fewer records, even less oversight, places where people could exist without leaving much behind. Investigators followed it as far as they could, and then they hit something unexpected. A name, different from both Whitaker and Harper, but connected through an old utility account linked to one of the payphone locations. The name was listed as a secondary contact, inactive, but not erased. Thomas R. Halle. No current address, no active records. But the name appeared once more in a document tied to Evelyn Harper, not as family, not as a spouse, but as something else. A cosigner on a financial document dated years before Margaret ever appeared in official records. That connection tightened the web. Evelyn, Margaret, Thomasade. 3 names now linked by fragments of a past that refused to stay buried. And suddenly, the case didn't feel like a single event anymore. It felt like a continuation. Something that had started long before Margaret Whitaker was ever found on that bedroom floor. Back at the house, investigators reopened areas that had already been cleared, not looking for new evidence. Looking at old evidence differently. The attic, the walls, the spaces people don't think to question unless they already suspect something hidden. And in the crawl space beneath the house, they found it. Not large, not obvious. A compartment. Crude, handmade, but intentional. Inside, nothing. Empty, but not unused. The wood was stained, darkened, not by age, not by moisture, by something else. Something that matched the one detail that had never made sense. Blood, a place where it could have been collected, contained, removed from the scene above, without leaving what should have been left behind. That discovery didn't answer anything, but it confirmed something far worse. The house had been part of it, not just a location, a component, designed, used. And if that was true, then Margaret hadn't just been killed there. She had been connected to whatever had happened before, possibly for years, possibly since before she ever became Margaret Whitaker. And Daniel, where did he fit into that? The missing husband, the assumed suspect, the man who might not even have been who he claimed to be. The narrative began to fracture under its own weight, because now there were too many unknowns to anchor anything certainty. Margaret might have been living under an identity that wasn't hers, connected to a woman who had vanished from records repeatedly over decades, linked to a man whose name existed only in the margins of documents that didn't explain his role. And somewhere along that line, something had gone wrong, violently, deliberately, the kind of wrong that ends a body on the floor and another person erased entirely. And yet, even with all of that, there was still no clear answer to the simplest question. Why? Why Margaret? Why then? Why in that house? The case didn't just stall. It deepened, like a hole that kept widening the more you tried to fill it. And somewhere beneath everything that had been uncovered, there was a truth that hadn't surfaced yet. Not because it was hidden well, but because no one was looking at it the right way. Not yet, but that would change. Because cases like this don't stay buried forever. They shift, they wait, and eventually, something forces them back into the light. The case didn't reopen with a headline. It shifted quietly. Years passed before anyone noticed. The file had already been boxed, archived, reduced to a number stamped across a spine that no one reached for unless they were looking for something specific or avoiding something else. Dust settled. Names faded into memory. The Whitaker house changed hands twice, repainted, repaired, stripped of its history until it looked like every other place on that road. But time doesn't erase pressure. It builds it. And sometimes that pressure finds a weakest point. In this case, it was a name, not Margaret, not Daniel, Thomas Erhale, the name that had lingered in the margins of old documents, too faint to chase when the case was active, too incomplete to mean anything on its own. But time had changed something else. Databases had grown, records had merged, and what had once been disconnected began to align. A clerk, different department, different purpose, ran a routine cross-reference on dormant financial accounts tied to deceased individuals. Evelyn Harper's name surfaced again. Not unusual. What was unusual was that the account had been accessed recently, not closed, not flagged, accessed, and the authorization code linked back to a name that hadn't appeared in decades. Thomas Erhale. That was the moment the file came back off the shelf. Cold case. Reactivated. Not with certainty. With suspicion. The account access was traced to a small branch bank nearly 2 counties over. Surveillance footage was limited, grainy, washed out, but it gave them something they hadn't had in years. Movement. A man, older, Thin, face partially obscured by a cap pulled low in the angle of the camera. He didn't linger, didn't speak, just approached, completed the transaction, and left. But there was one detail that didn't blur. His hands. Steady, deliberate, and on his right wrist. A mark, faint, but distinct. A thin line running across the skin, pale against age. Like an old scar. That image was pulled, enhanced, circulated internally. No immediate match. But it was enough to shift the investigation from memory back into motion. Because someone connected to that name was still alive and still active. The timeline stretched again. Decades now. From Evelyn Harper to Margaret Whitaker to a man who had just reached back into a dormant account as if it had never been forgotten. That wasn't coincidence. That was continuity. Investigators went back to the beginning, not of the case, but of the people. Evelyn Harper's gaps in records were revisited with a different lens. Instead of asking where she had been, they asked who she had been with. Patterns emerged. Locations where she had reappeared overlapped with quiet reports. Nothing criminal, nothing concrete, just fragments. Missing persons cases that never fully developed. Transient populations. Rural areas where documentation was thin and questions were fewer. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to suggest movement. Not random, guided. And Margaret had been in those photographs. Young, present, uniged across spans that should have shown time. That detail, once unsettling, now became critical, because it suggested she had been with Evelyn long before she entered official records, which meant her identity wasn't just fabricated, it was inherited, passed down, or passed along. The phrase family began to shift in meaning, not biological, not documented, but constructed, maintained, hidden. Investigators revisited the crawl space beneath the Whitaker house, the compartment, the stains. At the time, it had been labeled as a probable collection point, something used in the commission of the crime. Now, it looked older. The wood had layers, not one event, multiple. Faint variations in staining suggested repetition over time. That realization changed the weight of everything. Because if that space had been used more than once, then Margaret hadn't been the beginning. She had been part of something ongoing, something that operated quietly for years, possibly decades, beneath the surface of ordinary lives. And that meant the house hadn't just been a location. It had been a site. Deliberate, chosen, maintained across ownership. Evelyn to Margaret, Margaret to whoever came next. But something had interrupted that chain. Violently. The question was no longer just who killed Margaret Whitaker. It was what broke the pattern. The answer didn't come from the house. It came from a voice. A call, anonymous at first, routed through layers designed to obscure origin, but persistent. The same message delivered twice, then a third time when it became clear it wasn't being ignored. There's something you miss. No name, no details. Just that. Most calls like that get dismissed, filed, ignored, because they lead nowhere. But this one didn't feel random. It came after the account access, after the name resurfaced, after the file had been reopened, which meant someone knew, not just about the case, but about the investigation itself. That narrowed the possibilities and increased the risk. The call was eventually traced, not precisely, but enough to localize it to a region, a cluster of old rural lines still active in an area that hadn't modernized with the rest of the system. Investigators moved carefully, quietly, because if this was connected to whatever had been operating for decades, then exposure could shut it down again. Or worse, they found the source 2 days later. A house, isolated, not abandoned, but close. The kind of place that didn't attract attention because it had never tried to. The man who answered the door didn't match the image from the bank. He was younger, mid-30s, nervous, eyes that didn't settle. He denied making the call, at first, then hesitated, then asked a question that changed everything. Did you find her under the house? That was the moment the silence broke, because that wasn't public information. The crawl space, the compartment, the stains. None of that had ever been released, which meant one thing. He knew, not from reports, from experience. His name was Aaron Hale, and just like that, the line connected. Tomas Erhale, family, not confirmed yet, but likely, too likely to ignore. Aaron didn't resist, didn't run. He let them in, sat down, hands shaking just enough to notice. And then he started talking, not in a straight line, not clean, fragments, memories, things he said he didn't understand until recently. Stories passed down that never felt like stories, rules, patterns, things you don't question when you grow up inside them. He spoke about movement, about houses that were never permanent but always familiar, about names that changed depending on where they were, about a woman, older, quiet, who controlled everything without ever raising her voice. Evelyn. He didn't say her last name, but he didn't need to. He spoke about another woman, younger, different, but connected, Margaret. Except he didn't call her Margaret. He used another name, one that didn't exist in any official record, one that had never appeared in the investigation. And suddenly, Margaret Whitaker, the victim at the center of everything, fractured into something else. Someone else. Aaron described a system, not formal, not written, but enforced. A structure built on control, secrecy, and continuity. People moved. Identities shifted. Connections maintained through methods that avoided documentation. Cash, payphones, places where records didn't reach. And at the center of it, a purpose. He struggled to describe it. Not because he didn't know, but because he had never been given a language for it. Only the actions, only the expectations. And then he said something that stopped the room cold. They weren't supposed to stop. Not vague, not unclear, specific. Whatever had been happening, it had a rhythm, a pattern, and Margaret's death had broken it. That meant her death wasn't just an event. It was a disruption, a deviation. Something had gone wrong inside a system that had been running long enough to feel normal to those inside it. And Daniel Whitaker. Aaron hesitated when that name came up. Not recognition, not confusion. Something else. He looked down, then back up, and for the first time, there was certainty in his voice. That's not his real name. The case shifted again. Not wider this time. Deeper, because now, for the first time, there was a living connection to the past. A witness who didn't just see the edges, but had lived inside the structure itself. And whatever he knew, whatever he had just begun to reveal, was enough to suggest that the truth behind Margaret Whitaker's death wasn't just buried in evidence. It was buried in identity. And the moment that identity started to unravel, everything else would follow. Aaron Hale didn't start with answers. He started with rules. Not written, not spoken openly, but understood, absorbed the way children absorb things they don't yet have words for. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, fingers locked together as if holding something in place inside himself. And when he spoke, it wasn't like a confession. It was like translation. There were always three things, he said quietly. You don't stay too long. You don't use the same name twice. And you don't ask what happens in the rooms you're not invited into. The room didn't move. No one interrupted. Because the way he said it, flat, rehearsed without sounding practiced, suggested something deeper than memory. Conditioning, repetition over years that had blurred into instinct. He grew up moving. Not constantly, but regularly enough that nothing ever settled. Houses came and went. Towns changed. Schools were temporary, if they existed at all. Sometimes months in one place. Sometimes years. Always leaving before roots had time to take hold. There was always a reason, he said. Work, family, problems. It changed depending on who was asking. But inside, the rules didn't change. Inside, everything stayed the same. There was always someone in charge. At first, for Aaron, it was his father, Thomas. Not distant, not cold, just controlled. The kind of man who didn't raise his voice because he never needed to. The kind of presence that shaped behavior without explanation. And above him, there was Evelyn. Aaron never called her grandmother. Never mother. Just Evelyn. She decided things, he said. Where we went, when we left, who we were when we got there. Names weren't identities. They were tools. Used, discarded, replaced. And Margaret? One of the investigators asked. Aaron paused. Not long, but enough. She wasn't Margaret when I first knew her. The words landed without sound, because that confirmed what had only been suspected. Margaret Whitaker had not been Margaret Whitaker for most of her life. Aaron described her as younger than Evelyn, but older than everyone else in his world when he was a child. Quiet, observant, present without ever drawing attention to herself. She was important, he said, not like Evelyn, not in charge, but close. Trusted. That word wasn't spoken, but it sat there anyway. And then he said something that shifted the weight again. She taught me how to stay quiet. Not as a lesson, as a necessity. There were times, he said, when things happened in the houses they stayed in, rooms that were closed off, doors that weren't to be opened, sounds that weren't to be acknowledged. He didn't understand it then. Not fully, but he understood enough to know that silence wasn't optional. It was survival. Investigators let him speak without pushing too hard, because this wasn't something that could be forced. It had to unfold, piece by piece. And then came the first direct connection. The house in Texas, Aaron said, voice tightening slightly. That one was different. Different how? He took a breath. Permanent. Not in the sense of ownership, in the sense of purpose. They had returned to that house more than once before Margaret and Daniel officially lived there, before the names on the mailbox changed, before it looked like any other place on that road. It was already set up, he said, before we ever used those names. That aligned with what investigators had begun to suspect. The house wasn't just inherited. It was maintained, prepared, passed along like something functional, not personal. What happened there? Someone asked. Aaron didn't answer immediately. His hands tightened, then loosened. Then he spoke. Collection. The word sat heavier than anything else he had said. Not murder, not violence. Collection. As in blood? The question came, direct, unavoidable. He nodded, slow, reluctant, but certain. They said it mattered, he continued, that it had to be done right, that it couldn't be wasted. No one in the room moved, because now the missing piece, the detail that had never made sense, had a shape. The blood wasn't an accident. It wasn't cleanup. It was the point. Aaron struggled to explain the purpose behind it, not because he was hiding it, because he didn't have it. They didn't tell us why, he said, only that it had to be done, that it had always been done. A pattern, a ritual, a system passed down without explanation, enforced through repetition. And Margaret, she was part of it, Aaron said, not forced, not resistant, part of it, which reframed everything. Margaret Whitaker wasn't just a victim. She had been involved for years, maybe longer than anyone had realized. And then came the fracture. The last time, Aaron said, voice lowering, something changed. He had been older then, old enough to notice things that didn't align, old enough to recognize tension where there had once been routine. Margaret had argued with Evelyn, not openly, not loudly, but enough that it broke the pattern. She didn't want to do it anymore, Aaron said. Didn't want to continue. Didn't want to follow the rules. That kind of break doesn't go unnoticed in a system built on control. What about Daniel? The question came again. Aaron's expression shifted. This time, there was something closer to certainty. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not part of the original structure. Not raised inside it. Daniel Whitaker had entered later, as an outsider. Someone Margaret brought in. That alone was a violation. A risk, because outsiders ask questions. Outsiders notice things that insiders are trained to ignore. And he did, Aaron said. Daniel had started asking. Not directly. At first. Small things. Inconsistencies. Gaps. Then more. Pushing. testing boundaries that weren't meant to be touched. That's when everything started to break. Aaron said. The pattern disrupted. The system destabilized. And then, the night, the one that ended everything. Aaron wasn't there when it happened, but he knew enough. Fragments, aftermath, things said and unsaid. Margaret had refused. That much he was sure of. Refused to continue. Refused to follow through with what had been planned. And Evelyn, the question came quiet but sharp. Aaron looked down, then back up. She didn't allow that. The room tightened, because now the line between structure and violence had vanished, and what was left was control. Absolute. What about Daniel? The investigator pressed again. This time, Aaron didn't hesitate. He tried to stop it. That changed everything, because it meant Daniel Whitaker, the missing husband, the assumed suspect, might not have been the one who carried out the act. He might have been the one who interrupted it, the one who broke the system, the one who forced whatever happened next. What happened to him? Someone asked. Aaron shook his head. I don't know. But the way he said it suggested something else. Not that he didn't know, that he hadn't been told, which, in a system like this, meant one thing. Daniel had become a problem, and problems didn't stay. The room fell silent again, not from lack of questions, but from the weight of the ones that now existed. Margaret wasn't just a victim. She had been part of something hidden, something structured, something that required blood, collected, not spilled. And Daniel Whitaker, he hadn't just disappeared. He had stepped into something he didn't understand, tried to stop it, and then he was gone. But one question still remained, the one that hadn't been answered, the one that cut through everything else. If Margaret refused, the investigator said slowly, then who finished it? Aaron didn't respond immediately. His eyes shifted, not to anyone in the room, but somewhere else, somewhere deeper. And when he finally spoke, his voice dropped to almost nothing. It wasn't supposed to end like that. Not an answer, not directly, but enough, because in a system built on control, on repetition, on rules that weren't meant to be broken, a single refusal could unravel everything. And when something like that breaks, it doesn't stop cleanly. It fractures violently, unpredictably, and somewhere in that fracture, Margaret Whitaker ended up on the floor of that bedroom, her blood missing, her identity already gone, and Daniel still unaccounted for, still suspended between two possibilities, victim or something else entirely. And the deeper Aaron's words went, the clearer one thing became. This case had never been about a single night. It had been building for years. And whatever happened in that house wasn't the beginning. It was a moment everything finally collapsed. Aaron's words didn't close the gaps. They widened them, because for the first time, the case had a structure, but not a conclusion, a pattern, but not a final point. Everything he described aligned with the pieces investigators had been holding for years, turning fragments into something almost coherent. Almost. But almost doesn't solve a murder. It sharpens it. The task now wasn't to listen. It was to verify. Every claim Aaron made had to be tested against what little physical evidence still existed, what hadn't been lost to time, decay, or oversight. The Whitaker house had already been re-examined once. Now it was stripped again, deeper, more invasive, less cautious. Walls opened, floorboards lifted. The crawl space beneath the house became the center of everything. Because if Aaron was telling the truth, if the house had been used repeatedly, systematically, then traces wouldn't just exist. They would accumulate. And they had. Forensic analysis, updated with methods that hadn't existed in 1987, began to pull layers out of what had once been written off as degradation. The stains beneath the house, once categorized broadly, were now broken down. Multiple profiles. Not one, not two, more. Different individuals, different times, all converging in that same confined space beneath a house that had passed quietly from one name to another. That confirmation didn't just support Aaron's story. It transformed the case. Because now Margaret Whitaker wasn't an isolated victim. She was one in a sequence. And whatever system had been operating, it had left behind a trail that had never been properly understood. The investigation shifted outward again, not just who killed Margaret, but who had been part of everything before her. Evelyn Harper's history was reconstructed again, this time with a singular focus: movement and proximity to unsolved cases that had never been connected, rural disappearances, unidentified remains, incidents too small, too scattered to form a pattern on their own. But when mapped, they aligned, not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough. Locations where Evelyn had resurfaced matched areas where people had vanished without resolution, places where documentation was weak, where questions didn't travel far. And now, Texas, 1987 was an outlier. It was a point on a line, which brought everything back to one unavoidable conclusion. If the system had been operating for decades, then someone had been maintaining it, and that someone was still alive. Tomas Erhala, the name that had surfaced in fragments, was no longer peripheral. It was central. Aaron confirmed it. His father, the man who had enforced the rules, the man who had followed Evelyn, the man who had never explained, but always ensured, and now a man who had accessed an old account as if nothing had ended. Tracking him became the priority. Not easy. People who live outside systems don't leave convenient trails. No active employment records. No fixed address. No digital footprint. But patterns still exist. They always do. The bank footage gave them a location, a starting point. From there, small transactions were identified. Cash withdrawals, minor purchases, movements that avoided attention but couldn't avoid existence entirely. A gas station here, a supply store there. Always cash, always brief, always alone. The radius tightened. Days turned into a quiet surveillance operation. No announcements, no alerts, because if Thomas Hale was part of what Aaron described, then he wouldn't hesitate. And hesitation gets people killed. They found him on the fourth day, not hiding, not running, living, in a small structure on the edge of land that didn't belong to anyone in a way that could be easily traced. Weathered wood, no visibile utilitias, the kind of place that existed just outside the reach of formal systems. He was older than the footage suggested. Time had worn him down, but not softened him. When they approached, he didn't flee. He stepped outside before they even reached the door, like he had been expecting them. No weapon in his hands, no visible panic. Just stillness, controlled, the same word that had followed this case from the beginning. Thomas Hale, one of the investigators, said. He didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either, just watched, measured, and then he smiled. Not wide, not warm, just enough. That was the moment everything shifted from investigation to confrontation, because whatever this was, he wasn't surprised. They took him in without resistance. No struggle, no attempt to escape, as if movement had already run its course. The interrogation didn't begin immediately. It didn't need to. Men like Thomas Hale don't respond to pressure the way others do. They respond to precision, to control. So they gave him time, let the silence settle, let him understand that this wasn't 1987 anymore, that the things buried then had surfaced. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to deny. It wasn't to deflect. It was to correct. You're asking the wrong questions, he said calmly. That line landed harder than any confession, because it meant he wasn't afraid of what they knew. He was focused on what they didn't. Margaret Whitaker's name was the first brought up. He didn't react. Not visibly, but something in his posture shifted. Barely. Margaret isn't her name, he said. The same phrase Aaron had implied, now confirmed. Consistency, truth, or something close to it. Who was she, they asked. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether the answer mattered. Someone who forgot her place. Not anger, not grief. Assessment, cold, measured. And Daniel, another question. This time, the pause was longer. Not hesitation, calculation. He wasn't supposed to interfere. The same language, the same structure. rules, expectations, violations, everything aligned with Aaron's account. But alignment isn't enough. They needed specifics. The night, the house, what happened inside that bedroom. Thomas didn't resist the direction. He followed it, not like a man confessing, like a man explaining a process that had gone wrong. There was an order, he said. There's always an order. Preparation, timing, execution, words that should have sounded clinical, but carried something else beneath them. Habit. This one broke, he continued. Margaret had refused, just as Aaron said, refused to continue, refused to follow through. And that can't happen, Thomas added, voice still even. Why? The question came sharp. For the first time, something flickered, not emotion, something closer to belief. Because it doesn't stop with one. That was the closest he came to explaining purpose. Not clearly, but enough to suggest that whatever they had been doing, it wasn't random. It wasn't isolated. It was part of something they believed extended beyond individual acts. And Daniel, the question returned. This time, there was no delay. He got in the way. The room tightened, because now they were at the edge of the answer. What did you do to him? Thomas looked directly at the investigator, and for the first time, there was no ambiguity. He wasn't meant to survive it. Not past tense, not confirmation, but close enough. What happened? The demand sharpened. Silence stretched. Then he fought. That single word changed everything, because it meant the absence of defensive wounds on Margaret. Wasn't the full story. The violence hadn't been one-sided. Not entirely. There was interference, Thomas said. That changes things. The sequence began to form. Margaret refusing. Daniel intervening. The structure breaking. Control slipping. And then the investigator pressed. Thomas exhaled slowly. Not tired. Measured. As much as was necessary. Not a confession. But enough. Enough to draw the line. Enough to understand what had been missing. Daniel Whitaker hadn't disappeared cleanly. He had been removed. Just like the blood. Just like everything else that didn't fit the structure. The truck. The distance. The abandonment. All of it. A continuation of control. Even after the system had broken. Even after Margaret was already dead. What did you do with him? The question came, final. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He leaned back slightly, looked past them, not at the room, at something else. And when he spoke, his voice didn't change. But the words did. You already found part of it. That was the moment, the shift, because that didn't just imply disposal. It implied proximity, connection, something still tied to the house, something still buried in what had already been searched. And suddenly, the case didn't feel old anymore. It felt unfinished. Because if Daniel Whitaker had never truly left, if part of him had remained, then the answer hadn't been lost. It had been missed. And now, it was waiting to be found. What Thomas Hale said didn't feel like an ending. It felt like permission. A direction disguised a confession. You already found part of it. That line stayed in the room long after he stopped speaking. It didn't need elaboration. It didn't ask for interpretation. It simply existed, heavy, deliberate, and anchored to something physical they had overlooked for years. Part of it, not all of it, which meant Daniel Whitaker had never fully left the equation, not metaphorically, not narratively, physically. The Whitaker house had already been searched twice during the original investigation, once in 1987, once again years later during the cold case review. Each time, it had yielded nothing beyond what was already known. The crawlspace stains, the disturbed floorboards, the empty compartment beneath the structure. But empty is a dangerous word in investigations like this. It assumes completeness. It assumes finality. And Thomas Hale had just removed both assumptions from the table. The third search began before dawn. No press, no outside presence, just a small, control team brought in under renewed authorization. The house looked smaller now than it had in memory, as if time had compressed it, squeezed it into something tighter, more reluctant to reveal itself. Inside, The air still carried something faint. Not rot anymore. Not iron. Memory. The kind of stillness that builds when a place is held on to something too long. They started in the bedroom. Again, every inch of flooring re-examined, every seam of the walls rechecked. Technology had changed since the original investigation. Ground-penetrating scans, thermal mapping, structural density readings. What had once required inference could now be visualized. But even with all of that, nothing obvious appeared. At first, then the anomaly showed up. A void, not above ground. Below, the crawl space had been documented before, but this time the scan revealed something inconsistent with the surrounding soil pattern. A disruption. Too clean, too intentional. Not natural erosion, not structural shift. Something placed, something contained. The location was almost exactly beneath where Margaret Whitaker's body had been discovered. That alignment wasn't coincidence. It was design. The entry point was reopened. The same hatch. The same confined space beneath the house where years of speculation had already pointed, but never fully resolved. This time, they didn't just look. They excavated. The soil came away in layers, damp and compacted, resisting at first, as if the ground itself didn't want to release what it had been holding. Minutes stretched into hours. The deeper they went, the more deliberate the excavation became. No one spoke much, not because there was nothing to say, because saying anything felt premature. Then the shovel struck something different. Not soil, not wood, something denser. The sound changed immediately. Everyone in the space heard it, that shift in tone that separates ground from structure. Carefully, they cleared around it. A container, not large, not crude, intentional, metal, dulled by time and pressure, sealed in a way that suggested it had been meant to remain undisturbed. The lid was not forced. It was opened, slowly, deliberately, and when it finally gave way, the air changed again. Not smell, presence. Inside were remains, partial, carefully contained, not scattered, not accidental, arranged in a way that suggested handling, not abandonment. The confirmation didn't come immediately. It never does in moments like this. But there are things that don't require full identification to be understood. Clothing fragments, a wristwatch, personal effects that had survived where everything else had not. Daniel Whitaker had not left the property, not in full, not alive. The missing husband had been missing in a way no one had fully considered, because what had been found wasn't just remains. It was evidence of containment, deliberate concealment beneath the structure itself. And suddenly, the truck 60 miles away was an escape. It was a misdirection, a final movement designed to pull attention outward while the truth remained exactly where no one had thought to look again. Inside the house, under the floor, beneath everything. The realization didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with silence, the kind that presses down harder than any sound ever could. Back at the holding facility, Thomas Hale was informed. He didn't react immediately, not to shock, not to denial. He simply closed his eyes for a moment longer than necessary. When he opened them again, something in his posture had changed. Not regret, not remorse, recognition. "You found him," he said quietly. Not a question, a statement. The investigators didn't respond. They didn't need to, because now the structure he had described, the system of rules of control of continuity, had produced its final artifact. Not theory, not interpretation. Evidence. What was the purpose? One investigator asked finally. Thomas looked at them for a long moment, then answered in a voice that carried no hesitation. Containment. Not punishment. Not ritual. Containment. As if that single word explained everything. As if it justified what had been built over decades. But the house beneath the words told a different story now, because containment implies control, and control implies intention, and intention, when stretched across years, becomes something else entirely, a system, a belief, a structure that outlives the people inside it. Back at the scene, forensic teams worked carefully around the discovery. Everything had shifted now. The house was no longer just a crime scene. It was a layered archive of decisions made over time, each layer revealing something that had been deliberately hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. Margaret's position of death, the missing blood, the crawl space compartment, and now, Daniel Whitaker, not missing, not fleeing, not erased into absence, but placed. That distinction changed the narrative completely, because it meant the original assumption that Daniel was either suspect or victim in isolation was incomplete. He had been part of the structure, until he wasn't, until something broke it. Reports from Aaron Hale were revisited immediately. His earlier words, once fragmented and uncertain, now aligned with the physical evidence in ways that could no longer be dismissed. He tried to stop it. That line no longer sounded ambiguous. It sounded literal. Daniel Whitaker hadn't just discovered something. He had intervened in something already in motion. And Margaret's refusal wasn't just resistance. It was rupture. The system had reacted to both, differently, but decisively. And somewhere in that sequence, everything collapsed. The missing blood now made sense in a way it hadn't before. It wasn't removed for concealment alone. It was part of the process Aaron had described without fully understanding it. Collection, control, containment. The structure wasn't built around violence. It was built around repetition. And when repetition breaks, the system doesn't adapt. It reacts. The final confirmation came hours later. Forensic matching completed. DNA profiles aligned. Daniel Whitaker was officially identified. Not missing, not unknown, deceased. Contained beneath the house where his life had ended without acknowledgement for decades. The report would later describe it in clinical terms. Subsurface concealment confirmed. Victim recovery completed. Case status resolved. But none of those phrases captured what the house felt like after. Because resolution, in cases like this, doesn't restore order. It exposes what order was hiding. And beneath the Whitaker house, there had never been order, only structure, held together by silence, by repetition, by people who believed they were maintaining something rather than destroying it. When Thomas Hale was told the confirmation, he didn't speak for a long time, not immediately, not defensively, just quietly absorbing what had finally been made undeniable. Then, softly, it shouldn't have ended like that. Not remorse, not denial, recognition of deviation. Because even now, even with everything exposed, his frame of reference hadn't changed. The system had broken, not because it was flawed, but because it had been interrupted. And in his view, that interruption was a true failure. Outside, the Texas heat pressed down again, unchanged, indifferent, as if none of it had ever mattered to the landscape that had held it all in place. But inside the house, nothing would ever sit the same again, because what had been buried there wasn't just a body. It was the end of something that had lasted far longer than anyone had realized, and the beginning of the understanding that it had never been contained to one place, only discovered there. The Whitaker house was no longer just a crime scene. It had become a point of collapse, not because it held all the answers, but because it proved there had been a structure there in the first place. Something organized, something repeated, something that had operated long enough to leave layers beneath the soil like sediment built over decades of silence. And now that it was exposed, everything else had to move, fast. But systems like the one Thomas Hale described don't simply disappear when uncovered. They adapt in the only way they know how. They fracture. The first sign of that fracture wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Files that had been dormant for decades began to surface in unrelated jurisdictions. Missing persons cases from neighboring counties suddenly showed overlapping details that had never been cross-referenced. Old clerical notes, dismissed as irrelevant at the time, began forming patterns under modern review systems that didn't exist in 1987. Names repeated, locations overlapped, and one constant appeared again and again beneath the noise. Movement, not random, coordinated. But what mattered most wasn't the past. It was the present. Because within 48 hours of Daniel Whitaker's remains being officially confirmed, Aaron Hale stopped responding to check-ins. At first, It wasn't alarming. He had been through interviews, extended questioning, emotional exhaustion. His cooperation had been consistent, if unstable. Silence wasn't unusual, but this silence extended beyond acceptable limits, then beyond procedural ones, then beyond control. By the time agents arrived at the location where he'd been staying, the structure was already empty. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no belongings left behind, just absence. But absence in this case didn't feel like escape. It felt like continuation, because the way Aaron had spoken, carefully, selectively, as if translating a language he didn't fully trust, suggested something investigators had only begun to understand. He had not just witnessed the system, he had been inside it, and systems like that don't release their components easily. The search expanded immediately, not officially classified as pursuit, but treated as one, because Thomas Hale was still in custody, which meant Aaron was the only remaining living link between testimony and structure. And now, that link had been cut, or removed, or reclaimed. Meanwhile, Thomas Hale remained unchanged. That was the most unsettling part. Even after confirmation of Daniel Whitaker's remains, even after forensic validation containment beneath the house, even after structural mapping confirmed repeated use of the crawl space, he did not break. He did not retract. He did not deviate from a framework he had already established. Instead, he refined it. When questioned again, he returned to the same language: containment, order, continuity, as if the discovery of Daniel's remains had not altered meaning, but merely completed a cycle. That distinction alarmed investigators more than anything else, because it suggested that what they had uncovered was not a singular criminal act. It was a worldview, and worldviews like that are not dismantled by evidence. They are reinforced by interpretation. Back at the Whitaker site, forensic teams completed their final sweep. The house was no longer yielding new material evidence, but it was still yielding understanding. Layers of disturbance beneath structural points indicated repeated interaction with the subfloor over time, not accidental damage, not renovation. Access, intentional, controlled. The house had been entered beneath its visible structure more than once, across years that spanned ownership changes. That alone reframed everything. Margaret Whitaker was not the beginning of activity. She was part of a sequence, a role within something that had existed long before her identity had been assigned to that address. And Daniel's arrival had disrupted that sequence, not because he was violent, but because he was external. He did not understand the rules. And people who don't understand rules don't follow them. They break them. And breaking them inside a closed system creates pressure. Pressure demands resolution. And resolution in systems like this is never neutral. It is corrective. The investigation's attention returned once again to Thomas Hale, not as suspect, not as witness, but as anchor, because everything he described now aligned too cleanly with what had been physically uncovered, too structured, too consistent, too resistant to contradiction, which meant one of two things. Either he was reconstructing truth from fragments, or he had always been inside it. The turning point came unexpectedly, not from interrogation, but from a recorded interview that had been overlooked during initial review, a session with Aaron Hale conducted weeks before his disappearance, buried in administrative backlog due to volume and classification delays. When re-examined, one segment stood out: a question about Evelyn Harper. Aaron's response had been brief at the time, dismissive, but now it carried weight. "She never left," he had said. At the time, it seemed metaphorical. Now it didn't, because if Evelyn had never left, then the system had never ended. It had only changed form. The implication shifted the entire framework again. Evelyn Harper was no longer just a historical figure in the background of the case. She was the origin point, the earliest confirmed node in a pattern that extended forward, not backward. And if Thomas was correct in describing continuity, then Evelyn's influence had not been replaced. It had been carried, transferred, maintained, which meant Aaron's disappearance wasn't random. It was structural, a return, or retrieval. The search for him expanded outward, following every possible connection to known locations associated with his childhood movements. Abandoned properties, rural holdings, places that never fully entered public record systems. And in one of those locations, a structure was found, not active, not occupied, but recently disturbed. Inside, investigators found something unexpected, not evidence of confinement, but evidence of instruction, written fragments, repeated phrases, rules, short, incomplete, but unmistakably aligned with what Aaron had described. You don't stay too long. You don't use the same name twice. And you don't ask what happens in closed rooms. It wasn't a confession. It was a transmission. And beneath those fragments, a final line, unwritten, but implied. You continue. That discovery changed the direction of the case again. Because now Aaron wasn't simply missing. He was active within the system, or being reintegrated into it. And if that was true, then containment had never been the goal. It had been participation. Back at the holding facility, Thomas Hale was informed of Aaron's disappearance. This time, he reacted, not with denial, not with anger, but with something closer to resignation. He'll understand eventually, he said quietly. The investigators stared at him. Understand what? Thomas paused, then answered that it doesn't stop just because you see it. That statement didn't clarify. It redefined, because it suggested that awareness wasn't escape. It was transition. And the most disturbing implication of all was that Aaron hadn't been trying to leave. He had been completing something. The final report on Daniel Whitaker's case was being prepared at the same time. Cause of death, confirmed. Method, consistent with postmortem concealment beneath structure. Time frame, extended beyond initial estimation. Conclusion, containment within residential substructure. But those words, precise as they were, failed to capture the reality of what the Whitaker house had revealed. Because what had been discovered there wasn't just a crime. It was a system that functioned quietly across years, built on repetition, maintained through silence, and sustained by people who believed they were preserving order. And when that order broke, it didn't end. It redistributed, and somewhere beyond the edge of what could still be mapped, something was continuing, unseen, unconfirmed, but not unfamiliar, because systems like this don't collapse with exposure. They adapt to it, and then they wait for the next structure to hold them. The official case file was marked resolved on paper before anyone involved truly believed it was over. That was how systems worked. They didn't end cases. They closed them. And closure, in bureaucratic language, does not mean understanding. It means containment of uncertainty. It means reducing something unmanageable into a format that can be filed, archived, and forgotten. But the Whitaker case refused that kind of simplification. Even after Daniel Whitaker's remains were confirmed, even after the crawl space beneath the house had been fully documented, even after the layers of evidence had been stripped down, photographed, and translated into reports that stretched across departments, something remained unresolved, not in the evidence, in the people. Thomas Hale sat in custody longer than protocol required, not because he resisted, but because releasing him felt premature, as if letting him out of observation would undo something still fragile in the structure of understanding they had built. He didn't ask for release. He didn't request counsel beyond the first appointment. He simply existed in the space, unchanged by the outcome of the investigation. That alone unsettled everyone who interacted with him, because most suspects adapt under pressure. They shift, they fracture, they try to rebuild their identity around survival. Thomas did none of that. He remained consistent, as if consistency itself was proof of correctness. When asked again about Daniel Whitaker, his answer didn't change. He was part of the interruption. When asked about Margaret Whitaker, he paused only once before replying. She deviated. And when asked about Aaron Hale, for the first time, something flickered, not emotion, not regret, recognition. He's closer now than before, he said quietly. That statement was never fully understood. Not then, not officially, but it would linger in internal reports, highlighted, annotated, circled by analysts who couldn't determine whether it was metaphor or warning. Meanwhile, the absence of Aaron Hale became a parallel investigation of its own. No confirmed sightings, no financial activity, no communication. It was as if he had been absorbed into the same system he had described, without leaving the kind of trace investigators could follow. Search teams retraced known locations tied to his childhood movements. Abandoned properties, transient housing, rural stops. Each site revealed fragments, not of escape, but of pattern, repeated phrases, written rules, small marks carved into wooden beams or scratched into surfaces that had survived years of neglect. You continue. That phrase appeared more than once, not in the same handwriting, not in the same medium, but in the same structure of thought. That consistency made analysts uneasy because it suggested that Aaron had not been improvising his testimony. He had been reciting something already embedded in him, something learned long before the investigation ever began. Back at the Whitaker property, now officially secured and scheduled for demolition, one final sweep was conducted. Standard procedure, closure verification, ensuring no remaining evidence was overlooked. It should have been routine. It wasn't. During structural disassembly, a secondary anomaly was discovered beneath an exterior support beam that had not been previously disturbed. A narrow cavity, not large enough for concealment of a body, not designed for storage. Something else. Inside, investigators found a small metal object, corroded, unremarkable at first glance, but engraved, faint markings, lines and symbols that did not correspond to any known construction or household utility pattern. It took hours to identify even its basic structure, and when they did, it raised more questions than answers. The object had been placed deliberately within the foundation of the house, not as part of construction, but after, inserted into the structure like a marker, a point of reference, or initiation. That discovery reframed the entire property again, because it suggested the Whitaker house was not just a site of activity. It was a node, a designated point within a larger, undocumented system that extended far beyond a single family, a single case, or a single time period. And if that was true, then everything they had uncovered so far was only one segment of a much larger pattern. Thomas Hale was shown the object during a final review session. For the first time, his composure shifted, not dramatically, not visibly enough for a casual observer, but enough for trained investigators to notice. Recognition, not surprise. "You found the anchor," he said. That word was never explained, but it appeared later in internal documentation as a potential classification term used by analysts attempting to map the structure he had described. Anchor, point of stability, or control. When pressed further, Thomas refused to elaborate. Instead, he said something that would later become one of the most debated lines in the entire case record. "You think it ended because it broke. It didn't. It changed direction." No one knew how to interpret that at the time, but it lingered because it implied continuity, not termination. The final confirmation regarding Aaron Hale came weeks later. A partial identification, not direct, not definitive, but circumstantial evidence placing him at a location tied to another unresolved cold case from years prior. No official charges were filed. No arrest was made, because by the time investigators arrived, he was gone again, leaving behind only fragments, notes, repeated phrases, and one final line written in uneven handwriting across a torn piece of paper left behind in an abandoned structure. You don't leave it, you move through it. That sentence was never fully understood, but it marked the end of active pursuit, not because the case was solved, but because it stopped behaving like a case and started behaving like something else. Back in archival review, analysts attempted to summarize the Whitaker investigation for final closure documentation. They struggled. Every attempt at a linear narrative collapsed under its own contradictions. A missing husband who was both victim and interrupter. A wife who was both participant and rupture point. A family structure that operated without official recognition but left physical traces across decades. A secondary lineage that maintained continuity through movement, identity shifts, and controlled absence. And at the center, a house that functioned less like a location and more like an interface. Eventually, the report was finalized with a disclaimer: insufficient evidence to fully define operational structure. That sentence appeared in the final summary, but it did not resolve anything. It simply acknowledged limitation. The Whitaker house was demolished shortly after, not as punishment, not as ritual, but as policy. Remove the structure, remove the risk, erase the physical anchor. Yet even during demolition, workers reported something unusual, a sense of being watched, not by people, by absence. That detail was never included in official documentation, but it was recorded in private notes, and it would resurface later in internal discussions about residual system behavior in closed environments. Thomas Hale's final status was listed as deceased 2 years after incarceration. No formal cause beyond natural decline. No final statement. No last confession. Just a closed file. But those who reviewed his interviews repeatedly noted one unresolved pattern. He never referred to the system as something he had created, only something he had participated in. And that distinction mattered, because it implied that even he may not have been at the origin, only another node, another carrier, another continuation point. The Whitaker case, in its final archival form, spans thousands of pages, but its conclusion occupies only a few lines. Primary subjects accounted for: structural site decommissioned, associated network unverified, and beneath it, a final analyst note that was never officially approved for publication, but remained in internal circulation. Case exhibits characteristics consistent with distributed behavioral system persistence, full containment unconfirmed, which, translated outside of bureaucratic language, means only one thing: it didn't end, it dispersed. And somewhere in the gaps between confirmed facts and missing pieces, something remains active, not visible, not named, but still moving, still continuing, just out of frame. Long after the Whitaker file was marked inactive, it did not disappear. It migrated from active investigation logs to archived analytical studies, from regional jurisdiction reports to centralized behavioral pattern reviews, and eventually into a category that had no public-facing label at all: unclassified systemic continuity anomaly, a phrase too sterile to carry what implied. But in private circles, among analysts who had followed the case long enough to recognize patterns beyond coincidence, it was referred to differently, not as a case, not as a crime, but as a lineage, because by the time all known threads had been traced, Whitaker, Harper, Hale, and the fragment of identities between them, the conclusion no one wanted to articulate had already begun forming. This was not a sequence of isolated events. It was inheritance, not biological, behavioral, structural, and like all inheritances that survive long enough, it had an origin point that predated documentation. The breakthrough came years after Thomas Hale's death had been formally recorded and quietly filed away. There was no announcement, no renewed investigation, only a routine digital migration of old case files into a long-term data preservation system designed to consolidate unresolved historical cases. It was during that migration that an anomaly was detected, a cross-reference match, not between suspects, not between victims, but between phrasing patterns. The system flagged it automatically, a linguistic fingerprint recurring across unrelated case transcripts spanning decades. Not exact repetition, but structural similarity, short imperative statements, behavioral rules, control-based phrasing. You don't stay too long. You don't use the same name twice. You continue. At first, analysts dismissed it as coincidence, psychological residue, survivorship bias in documentation. People under stress often generate similar directive language, but the algorithm did not stop. It expanded its comparison range. And what emerged was something no one expected. The same structural phrasing appeared not just in the Whitaker investigation, but in older, unrelated cases from different states. different decades, different investigators, cases that had never been connected in any formal sense. Missing persons files from the 1960s, unresolved rural disappearances from the 1970s, cold cases that had never been revisited because nothing had linked them together before. But now, a pattern emerged, not in victims, not in perpetrators, in language. And language, when structured consistently enough across time, is rarely accidental. It implies transmission, training, or repetition of instruction. That discovery forced a full retrospective review of archival materials that had never been digitized properly. Physical records were retrieved, boxes opened, microfiche scanned, handwritten notes reanalyzed with modern pattern recognition tools. And in that expanded dataset, the structure began to solidify, not as a single organization, not as a coordinated network, but as something looser, more adaptive, a behavioral system that appeared to replicate itself through proximity rather than hierarchy. There were no founding documents, no identifiable leadership trail, no consistent naming convention across cases. And yet, the same structural behaviors appeared again and again. Control of identity, controlled movement, isolation of individuals from external reference points, and in nearly every case that matched the pattern at its most complete level, a location that functioned as an anchor point, not always a house, sometimes a farm, sometimes a rural property, sometimes an abandoned structure that had been reused repeatedly without official record continuity, but always a place where events clustered, where disappearances converged, where records became inconsistent. The Whitaker house was simply one of the most well-documented examples, not because it was unique, but because it survived long enough to be examined in detail. As analysts expanded the search parameters, a troubling realization emerged. The system did not appear to originate from a single source. Instead, it behaved like something that spread, through people, through families, through relocation patterns that mirrored each other across decades without direct connection. And within that spread, certain names reappeared in altered forms. Harper, Halle, Whitaker, not necessarily blood relatives, not always legally connected, but consistently present within overlapping case clusters. At that point, the investigation shifted from criminal inquiry to structural mapping. And that is when the final buried layer of the Whitaker case resurfaced. A forgotten supplemental interview with Aaron Hale, recorded but never fully transcribed due to system backlog during the final days of active investigation. When recovered and processed with updated transcription tools, one segment stood out. A question asked late in the session. If the system existed before you, who started it? Aaron's response had originally been marked as unclear, but in full context, it was not unclear at all. It was precise. It doesn't start. It stabilizes. That line changed everything, because it reframed origin not as an event, but as a condition. Stabilization implies prior instability, which suggests that what investigators have been treating as a structure system may have begun as something far less defined, something adaptive, something that emerged in response to repetition, environment, and survival behavior across multiple unrelated groups over time. Not a conspiracy, not a single organization, but a pattern that learned to maintain itself through human behavior. The implication was staggering, because if true, then removing individuals like Thomas Hale or identifying anchors like the Whitaker house did not dismantle the system. It only interrupted a local instance of it. Elsewhere, it could continue, and possibly already was. That realization led to a final internal review initiative labeled Pattern Continuity Risk Assessment. Its purpose was simple: determine whether the Whitaker case represented an isolated anomaly or a functional expression of a larger persistent structure. The preliminary findings were never fully released, but internal summaries leaked into restricted analyst circulation contained one consistent conclusion: behavioral recurrence confirmed across geographically and temporally isolated cases. Structural independence unverified. Systemic emergence hypothesis remains plausible. Translated outside bureaucratic language, the meaning was clear. What happened in the Whitaker house was not unique. It was repeatable. and possibly repeated. That conclusion reopened old questions that had been officially closed for years, including cases once thought unrelated, including names that had been archived and forgotten, including patterns that had never been given context because no one had seen them as connected. And in every reconstructed timeline that matched the structure, there was always a point of disruption. Someone refusing, someone interfering, someone breaking continuity, which suggested that the system did not rely solely on compliance. It relied on absence of interruption. And when interruption occurred, the outcome was never consistent. Sometimes containment, sometimes disappearance, sometimes restructuring, but always reaction. The final known reference to Aaron Hale appears in a footnote of a regional archive update 5 years after the Whitaker demolition. A single line, subject associated with continuity pattern exhibits unverified reappearance in adjacent jurisdictional case cluster. Confirmation pending. No follow-up report was ever published. No confirmation was ever officially recorded. And Thomas Hale remains listed in historical files as a resolved custody case. But analysts who continue to review the Whitaker materials note a recurring concern, not about what happened, but about what was not contained. Because every layer that was removed from that case revealed something deeper still attached beneath it. And the deeper they went, the less it resembled a crime, and the more it resembled a structure that adapts to being seen, which leads to the final unresolved question left in the archive, not who started it, not who ended it, but whether it can ever truly end at all. Because if a system survives not through individuals, but through repetition of behavior, then removing the people who enact it does not erase it. It only pauses it. And somewhere, in places that never make it into reports or archives or official summaries, the pattern continues. Quiet, unmarked, waiting for the next point of stabilization. Long after the Whitaker file was marked inactive, it did not disappear. It migrated from active investigation logs to archived analytical studies, from regional jurisdiction reports to centralized behavioral pattern reviews, and eventually into a category that had no public-facing label at all. Unclassified systemic continuity anomaly, a phrase too sterile to carry what implied. But in private circles, among analysts who had followed the case long enough to recognize patterns beyond coincidence, it was referred to differently, not as a case, not as a crime, but as a lineage. Because by the time all known threads had been traced, Whitaker, Harper, Hale, and the fragment of identities between them, the conclusion no one wanted to articulate had already begun forming. This was not a sequence of isolated events. It was inheritance, not biological, behavioral, structural, and like all inheritances that survive long enough, it had an origin point that predated documentation. The breakthrough came years after Thomas Hale's death had been formally recorded and quietly filed away. There was no announcement, no renewed investigation, only a routine digital migration of old case files into a long-term data preservation system designed to consolidate unresolved historical cases. It was during that migration that an anomaly was detected, a cross-reference match, not between suspects, not between victims, but between phrasing patterns. The system flagged automatically, a linguistic fingerprint recurring across unrelated case transcripts spanning decades. Not exact repetition, but structural similarity, short imperative statements, behavioral rules, control-based phrasing. You don't stay too long. You don't use the same name twice. You continue. At first, analysts dismissed it as coincidence, psychological residue, survivorship bias in documentation. People under stress often generate similar directive language, but the algorithm did not stop. It expanded its comparison range. And what emerged was something no one expected. The same structural phrasing appeared not just in the Whitaker investigation, but in older, unrelated cases, from different states, different decades, different investigators, cases that had never been connected in any formal sense. Missing persons files from the 1960s, unresolved rural disappearances from the 1970s, cold cases that had never been revisited because nothing had linked them together before. But now, a pattern emerged, not in victims, not in perpetrators. In language, and language, when structured consistently enough across time, is rarely accidental. It implies transmission, training, or repetition of instruction. That discovery forced a full retrospective review of archival materials that had never been digitized properly. Physical records were retrieved, boxes opened, microfiche scanned, handwritten notes reanalyzed with modern pattern recognition tools. And in that expanded dataset, the structure began to solidify, not as a single organization, not as a coordinated network, but as something looser, more adaptive, a behavioral system that appeared to replicate itself through proximity rather than hierarchy. There were no founding documents, no identifiable leadership trail, no consistent naming convention across cases, and yet the same structural behaviors appeared again and again: control of identity, controlled movement, isolation of individuals from external reference points, and in nearly every case that matched the pattern at its most complete level, a location that functioned as an anchor point, not always a house, sometimes a farm, sometimes a rural property, sometimes an abandoned structure that had been reused repeatedly without official record continuity, but always a place where events clustered, where disappearances converged, where records became inconsistent. The Whitaker house was simply one of the most well-documented examples, not because it was unique, but because it survived long enough to be examined in detail. As analysts expanded the search parameters, a troubling realization emerged. The system did not appear to originate from a single source. Instead, it behaved like something that spread through people, through families, through relocation patterns that mirrored each other across decades without direct connection. And within that spread, certain names reappeared in altered forms. Harper, Hale, Whitaker, not necessarily blood relatives, not always legally connected, but consistently present within overlapping case clusters. At that point, the investigation shifted from criminal inquiry to structural mapping, and that is when the final buried layer of the Whitaker case resurfaced. A forgotten supplemental interview with Aaron Hale, recorded but never fully transcribed due to system backlog during the final days of active investigation. When recovered and processed with updated transcription tools, one segment stood out. A question asked late in the session: if the system existed before you, who started it? Aaron's response had originally been marked as unclear, but in full context, it was not unclear at all. It was precise. It doesn't start. It stabilizes. That line changed everything, because it reframed origin not as an event, but as a condition. Stabilization implies prior instability, which suggests that what investigators have been treating as a structured system may have begun as something far less defined, something adaptive, something that emerged in response to repetition, environment, and survival behavior across multiple unrelated groups over time. Not a conspiracy, not a single organization, but a pattern that learned to maintain itself through human behavior. The implication was staggering, because if true, then removing individuals like Thomas Hale or identifying anchors like the Whitaker house did not dismantle the system. It only interrupted a local instance of it. Elsewhere, it could continue, and possibly already was. That realization led to a final internal review initiative labeled Pattern Continuity Risk Assessment. Its purpose was simple: determine whether the Whitaker case represented an isolated anomaly or a functional expression of a larger persistent structure. The preliminary findings were never fully released, but internal summaries leaked into restricted analyst circulation contained one consistent conclusion: behavioral recurrence confirmed across geographically and temporally isolated cases. Structural independence unverified. Systemic emergence hypothesis remains plausible. Translated outside bureaucratic language, the meaning was clear. What happened in the Whitaker house was not unique. It was repeatable, and possibly repeated. That conclusion reopened old questions that had been officially closed for years, including cases once thought unrelated, including names that had been archived and forgotten, including patterns that had never been given context because no one had seen them as connected. And in every reconstructed timeline that matched the structure, there was always a point of disruption. someone refusing, someone interfering, someone breaking continuity, which suggested that the system did not rely solely on compliance. It relied on absence of interruption, and when interruption occurred, the outcome was never consistent. Sometimes containment, sometimes disappearance, sometimes restructuring, but always reaction. The final known reference to Aaron Hale appears in a footnote of a regional archive update 5 years after the Whitaker demolition. A single line, subject associated with continuity pattern exhibits unverified reappearance in adjacent jurisdictional case cluster, confirmation pending. No follow-up report was ever published. No confirmation was ever officially recorded. And Thomas Hale remains listed in historical files as a resolved custody case. But analysts who continue to review the Whitaker materials note a recurring concern, not about what happened, but about what was not contained. Because every layer that was removed from that case revealed something deeper still attached beneath it. And the deeper they went, the less it resembled a crime, and the more it resembled a structure that adapts to being seen, which leads to the final unresolved question left in the archive, not who started it, not who ended it, but whether it can ever truly end at all. Because if a system survives not through individuals, but through repetition of behavior, then removing the people who enact it does not erase it. It only pauses it. And somewhere, in places that never make it into reports or archives or official summaries, the pattern continues. Quiet, unmarked, waiting for the next point of stabilization. The air inside the Montgomery County courtroom felt heavier than concrete. Reporters filled every bench. Camera shutters snapped in violent bursts. Old detectives sat shoulder to shoulder beside retired deputies who had spent half their careers chasing ghosts through dusty Texas backroads. Some of them looked exhausted. Some looked angry. Some looked like men who had finally reached the end of a nightmare they were never supposed to solve. And in the middle of it all sat Daniel Reeves, 72 years old, silver-haired, thin-framed, wearing a navy sweater over a pressed white shirt, looking less like a killer than a grandfather waiting for church service to begin. No handcuffs, no emotion, just stillness, the kind of stillness investigators had come to fear. Outside the courthouse, people gathered behind barricades under a gray January sky. Many of them had not spoken the victim's name aloud in decades. Some carried faded newspaper clippings sealed in plastic sleeves. Others carried candles. One woman stood silently near the corner of the street holding a photograph from 1987, edges curled with age, showing a smiling teenage girl beside a rusted pickup truck at a county fair. Her sister, 29 years old when she was murdered, 58 now only in memory. The prosecution laid out the timeline with brutal precision. June 17, 1987. The victim disappeared after leaving a late shift at a diner outside Huntsville. Her car was found abandoned 3 miles away near a drainage ditch. Purse still inside. Keys missing. One shoe discovered in the mud. No witnesses. No arrests. The case collapsed into silence almost immediately. For years, investigators believed they were hunting a transient drifter moving through East Texas. Then they believed it was a local predator already dead. Then they believed the evidence itself had been contaminated beyond recovery. Every theory failed. Every lead died, until the family's secret surfaced. The jury listened as prosecutors described the anonymous letter mailed to the sheriff's office 33 years after the murder. No return address. No fingerprints. Only 6 words typed across plain white paper. Asked what happened at the lake. At first, detectives dismissed it as another cruel hoax. The case had attracted dozens over the years. Psychics, false confessors, attention seekers. But one retired investigator recognized the phrase immediately. Lake Raven, a place connected to an old rumor buried deep inside witness statements from 1987. A rumor about an argument, about blood on denim, about a terrified younger brother who never spoke publicly again. That younger brother was Michael Reeves. The courtroom turned silent as his videotaped interview played for the jury. Even now his voice sounded shaken. He described a childhood ruled by fear, a father obsessed with appearances, a mother who ignored violence so long as the neighbors never saw it, and an older brother, Daniel, whose temper exploded without warning. Michael described nights hiding in closets while furniture shattered downstairs. Described seeing Daniel return home the morning after the murder with scratches across his neck and mud covering his boots. Described hearing him whisper something at the kitchen sink while scrubbing his hands raw under hot water. She wouldn't stop screaming. For decades, Michael buried the memory, until cancer convinced him he would die before the truth came out. The defense fought back aggressively. They argued memory was unreliable after 30 years. They attacked the chain of custody surrounding the forensic evidence. They insisted detectives manipulated a dying man desperate to ease his conscience. But then prosecutors revealed the final piece. DNA extracted from saliva beneath the victim's fingernails using technology unavailable in the 1980s. Tiny fragments, almost invisible, enough to identify a familial connection, enough to narrow the suspect pool to the Reeves bloodline. And when investigators secretly collected Daniel Reeves's discarded coffee cup from a local diner in 2024, the match came back nearly perfect. 1 in 11.4 trillion. The courtroom froze. Several jurors stared directly at Daniel Reeves after hearing the statistic. He never looked back. He simply folded his hands together tighter and continued staring at the wood grain on the defense table as though none of it concerned him. But the most chilling moment came later. Prosecutors introduced evidence from a storage unit rented under a false name in 1992. The unit had remained unpaid and abandoned for years until auction records resurfaced during the investigation. Inside, investigators discovered old hunting equipment, newspapers, family photographs, and a rusted tackle box. Hidden beneath the tray lining sat a thin gold necklace tangled around a cracked charm shaped like a rose. The victim's mother collapsed when shown the photograph. She had given that necklace to her daughter on her 17th birthday. No explanation existed for how it ended up buried inside Daniel Reeves's property. The defense tried suggesting evidence planting, contamination, mishandling, but momentum inside the courtroom had shifted permanently. Detectives who once feared this case would die forgotten could feel the weight finally turning toward justice. Yet even then, something remained unfinished. Something darker still hiding beneath decades of silence. Because investigators no longer believed the 1987 murder was his only crime. 3 counties reopened unsolved case files within weeks of the arrest. Missing women, abandoned vehicles, partial skeletal remains found near oil fields during the late 80s and early 90s. Similar patterns, similar geography, similar timelines. In one cold case from 1991, a waitress vanished less than 40 miles from where the original victim disappeared. Her body was never found, but investigators recently confirmed tire impressions photographed at the scene matched the tread pattern of a truck Daniel Reeves owned during that period. Another case involved a hitchhiker last seen entering a dark pickup outside Lufkin in 1989. Witnesses described the driver as calm, polite, older than 30, with a deep Southern accent and mirrored sunglasses. The same mirrored sunglasses appeared in dozens of family photographs shown during trial. The community began questioning everything. How many times had they stood beside him at football games? How many church picnics? How many funerals? Neighbors described him as quiet, helpful, respectful. He fixed fences for elderly couples, donated kin food every Thanksgiving, sang hymns beside his wife every Sunday morning. One former co-worker told reporters, "If you asked me to pick the least likely man in Texas to be arrested for murder, I would have picked him." That sentence echoed across national headlines for weeks. But beneath the public shock came another emotion, rage. Rage that the victim's mother died in 2011 before learning the truth. Rage that evidence sat untouched for decades while technology evolved around it. Rage that witnesses stayed silent out of fear. Rage that a family protected its own secrets, while another family buried their daughter without answers. During closing arguments, the prosecution said something that seemed to drain the final breath from the room. Time did not erase this crime. It preserved it. Every year the defendant believed he escaped justice became another year the truth waited patiently in the dark. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. Guilty. Daniel Reeves showed no reaction as the verdict was read. No tears. No anger. Nothing. The victims' remaining relatives wept openly behind prosecutors. One juror later admitted she could still hear the victim's final moments in her head after listening to forensic testimony. Another said the necklace haunted her more than anything else. "He kept it," she whispered to reporters afterward. "That's what monsters do. They keep trophies." As deputies escorted Reeves from the courtroom, one reporter shouted a question everybody wanted answered. How many others were there? For the first time all trial, he paused. Slowly, he turned his head toward the crowd and smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just a tiny movement at the corner of his mouth. Cold, knowing, almost amused. Then he disappeared behind the steel courtroom doors forever. Months later, investigators searched more than 40 acres of wooded property once owned by the Reeves family. Cadaver dogs alerted near a dry creek bed behind an abandoned barn collapsed from years of storms and neglect. Excavation teams uncovered fragments of women's clothing, rusted jewelry, and bone material too damaged for immediate identification. The FBI joined the investigation quietly. Officials refused public comment. But locals noticed something unsettling almost immediately. Patrol cars returned to roads untouched since the early 90s. Helicopters circled pine forests once considered empty wilderness. Old missing person flyers started reappearing in storefront windows. Texas realized a nightmare might have been larger than anyone imagined. Even now, the original murder scene remains scarred into local memory. Drivers passing the isolated stretch of road outside Huntsville still slowed down near the drainage ditch where the victim's car was discovered nearly 40 years ago. Some leave flowers beside the guardrail. Others leave handwritten notes. One message appeared repeatedly over the last year. Taped to signs, slipped beneath candles, written in black marker across folded paper, exposed to rain and heat and dust. She waited a lifetime to be heard. And somewhere beyond the flashing cameras, beyond the courtroom chaos, beyond the old evidence boxes and forensic reports and whispered confessions, one terrifying question still refuses to die inside Texas law enforcement. If a frightened brother had never broken his silence, anyone have ever known the monster was hiding inside the family all along?